So hello everyone, and welcome to our University College Cork Study of Religions Research Seminar Series. We're delighted to welcome Dr. Aled Thomas for his talk From Scientology to Scientologies, Practicing the Tech in the Free Zone. And just as a little abstract, in establishing the Church of Scientology during the 1950s, L. Ron Hubbard set in place a series of orthodox guidelines concerning the application of his spiritual technology known as the tech. Of particular note was his insistence that the tech should only be practiced and disseminated within the Church of Scientology, thus prohibiting application of the tech outside the institution. Recent decades, however, have seen the emergence of free zone and independent Scientology, groups and individuals practicing Scientology outside the Church, whilst identifying as Scientologists. This talk will explore the emergence of these Scientologies and the central role played by the tech, particularly the practice of auditing, in discourses surrounding authenticity, innovation, and material culture. Aled Thomas is an associate lecturer at the Open University and co-founder of alt.ac.uk. He completed his PhD at the Open University in 2019, focusing on the practice of auditing in emerging forms of free zone Scientologies. His research interests include fluid forms of contemporary religion, material culture, and lived religion. Dr. Thomas is also the author of the Free Zone Scientology, Contesting the Boundaries of a New Religion, recently published by Bloomsbury Academic Press. So we're looking forward to hear more. Aled, so I'll pass it over to you.
Fantastic, thanks very much. And yes, I just want to give a quick thank you to Dr. Jenny Butler for inviting me today. It's always a treat to get to talk about Scientology. I do it at any opportunity because I find it endlessly fascinating, and I hope that you do too. So today I want to spend some time talking about research that I conducted during my PhD. That I've recently published as a book, and specifically I want to speak concerning the idea of Scientologies. Now, the academic study of Scientology, as I'll get to later on in this presentation, has predominantly focused on the Church of Scientology. And if you hear discussions about Scientology, whether that's on the TV or on the radio or so forth, chances are they are talking about the Church. But the reality is that there are different types of Scientologies, and as I always say to my students, there's no such thing as Christianity, but Christianities. I try to do the same with Scientologies. So avoiding a one-size-fits-all approach to the study of religion. So today, I want us to begin with this very blurry shot of a man called Captain Bill Robertson. And the reason that this is quite a blurry shot is that it's from a very old videotape. And you can find it on YouTube. And if you've got a spare half an hour or 40 minutes to spare, I recommend that you do, because it's an incredibly interesting moment in Scientology history. This isn't necessarily the moment when Scientologies began, as in different types of Scientology, but it is a pivotal moment in the emergence of what's become known as free zone Scientology. And free zone Scientology is an umbrella term that's generally used to encompass all different types of Scientology, whether that's individual groups or individual practitioners who practice independently, who are doing Scientology outside of the remit of the Church of Scientology. And this is a man called Captain Bill Robertson. He was a close personal friend of L. Ron Hubbard's, the founder of the Church of Scientology. And he was the only person, apart from Hubbard's wife, that was promoted to the rank of captain in Scientology. The Church of Scientology makes heavy use of naval imagery and titles. L. Ron Hubbard, for example, was a Commodore. And Captain Bill Robertson was a trusted ally of his. And this footage is from the Crown Hotel in East Grinstead, down in the south of England, which is near the Church of Scientology's British headquarters. L. Ron Hubbard spent a few years of his life living in St. Hill, which is at East Grinstead, and there he developed many aspects of Scientology. So it's become a place of importance for Scientologists today. And the Crown Hotel was essentially a pub down the road. And he had gathered a group of Scientologists to tell them that essentially L. Ron Hubbard had lost control of the Church of Scientology, that the Church of Scientology had now been infiltrated by government agents who were intent on seizing the tech, that's the spiritual practice in Scientology, seizing the tech and using it outside of the Church of Scientology. It goes without saying that there are a lot of unsubstantiated claims during this speech, and it's very much laced with what many people would describe as conspiracy theories. But Captain Bill Robertson was a very charismatic speaker, and a lot of people did listen to him. And this is generally when the free zone is believed to have been truly established. So the term free zone is most closely associated with Bill Robertson. So it's from this period, from the 1980s to the present day, that I want us to concern ourselves with this afternoon. So as I've mentioned, today I'm talking about Scientologies and trying to distance our discussion of Scientology away from this Church of Scientology centric idea. The Church of Scientology has very rigorously controlled its public image with varying levels of success. But what it has been very successful in doing is positioning itself as the only form of Scientology. If you speak to a Church of Scientology member, the chances are they will tell you that free zone Scientologists are simply not Scientologists. It's not that they have different interpretations or different understandings of Scientology. They are simply not Scientologists. They are not doing Scientology. And this approach has really filtered into academic discourses as well. It's only very recently that scholars such as James Lewis and Kirsty Hellesoy have recently started discussing the free zone in their work. But it is beginning to grow, and that is very interesting. I'm going to give us a quick crash course in Scientology, though, for those of us who may not be familiar, because despite its status as a new religion, and I prefer to talk about Scientology as a contemporary religion rather than a new religion, but that's another rant for another time. I appreciate that in this short time period, a lot has happened in the history of Scientology. So as you may very well be familiar, the Church of Scientology was founded by L. Ron Hubbard. He was a pulp fiction author. He's most widely known for being a sci-fi author, although he did write westerns and romantic novels and all sorts of genres. And when I've discussed his work with members of the Church of Scientology, they've always told me that essentially he was doing it as a day job, that his true passion was in developing Scientology and understanding the human mind. And this culminated in the publication of a book called Dianetics, The Modern Science of Mental Health in 1950. This was based on years of research that L. Ron Hubbard did on the human mind, and specifically what's holding human beings back, what causes our anxieties, our neuroses, how can we improve our lives. And the publication of Dianetics was essentially a secular process. Dianetics is not, on surface value, a religious book. L. Ron Hubbard, in fact, even mocks religion in Dianetics. It's in the handful of years following his publication that L. Ron Hubbard continued doing his research into the human mind. And when addressing anxieties associated with experiences that we may have had, L. Ron Hubbard claimed to discover that actually we weren't just being held back by what's happened in our lives thus far, we're also being held back by past lives. And it's this belief in past lives that's introduced what he described as the religion angle of Scientology. So there's this process between Dianetics and Scientology, and it's important to note that people were already doing the Dianetics and so forth outside of L. Ron Hubbard's lecture sessions and so forth, putting their own spin on it. And some would say that establishing the Church of Scientology, and there's a number of reasons as to why the Church of Scientology was established, but some would say that part of it was attempting to control the tech. So throughout his lifetime, L. Ron Hubbard became known as Source in Scientology, the source of all philosophical and scientific knowledge, and therefore holds a position of authority and almost devotion in the Church of Scientology. And I'm saying that because I want to come back to it later with these free zoners, as I like to call them. So a little bit of foreshadowing there. So central to Scientology is the tech. The tech is essentially a practice called auditing, and it is the work of Dianetics. It's the work of Scientology, that an individual is able to remove neuroses from their mind that can improve their lives. And in that transition from Dianetics to Scientology, L. Ron Hubbard established that, well, you're not simply treating yourself, you're treating your spirit, you're treating your soul, or in other words, your thetan. If you're familiar with some of Scientology's jargon, you will have heard the term thetan. And for Scientologists, you do not have a thetan, you are a thetan. And in this sense, Scientology very much embodies what Brian Wilson and Roy Wallace framed as this worldly salvation, the framework of a new religion that doesn't promise salvation in an afterlife or in years to come, that salvation or spiritual benefits can be almost immediate. So Scientologists believe that you can experience the benefits of Scientology in this lifetime, not necessarily in the next. And part of this is, of course, the famous e-meter. When somebody takes part in an auditing session, they will hold you can see a picture that I took on the left-hand side of the e-meter. They hold two metal cylinder cans that measure the galvanic skin response of an individual as they recall stories from their lives that are associated with traumatic events and so forth. And the e-meter is a fascinating device because, as you can probably see there, there's a needle. It's often compared to a lie detector. The needle will move in response to the skin response of the individual. And when I was at the Church of Scientology, I was given a stress test, which was a little example of how the e-meter works. And as I was answering these questions, I'm obliged to say I am an outsider to the Church of Scientology. I'm not a Scientologist. But as I held the device, I could see the needle moving in response to the electric currents in my skin. And that was really fascinating to see. But for Scientologists, it is not necessarily measuring the electricity in your skin. It is actually picking up on engrams. And engrams are the terms for past life neuroses that can be removed. So as individuals, you are being held back by your engrams. Scientology helps remove that engram. I've put a picture from South Park in as well to show that the e-meter has become almost iconic for Scientology. And when Scientology is lampooned in popular culture, they will often turn to the e-meter. So the e-meter is an excellent piece of material culture that allows us to explore Scientology. And now this brings us right up to date before I get into the free zone. Following Hubbard's death in 1986, the Church of Scientology has been led by a man called David Miscavige. Now, there's a distinction between what Hubbard did and what David Miscavige does. Hubbard didn't create the tech, he discovered the tech. This is quite interesting about Scientology. The tech has always existed. L. Ron Hubbard didn't create it, he discovered it. But David Miscavige doesn't develop tech, rather he's almost a management figure. For David Miscavige, he is running the Church of Scientology, not developing Scientology. So he has established the Religious Technology Center, which is an institution independent of the Church of Scientology that aims to preserve the work and teachings of L. Ron Hubbard and ensure that it's correctly applied across churches of Scientology around the world. So one of the best ways to outline what the free zone is to actually say what it isn't, because the free zone is a really diverse category. So since the Church of Scientology was established by L. Ron Hubbard, it lays claim to an authenticity. It's an institutionalized body. If you go into a Church of Scientology anywhere around the world, you will find the same texts from the same publishers, and to use the phrase, everyone is singing from the same hymn sheet. Now, of course, from the lived religion perspective, this doesn't necessarily mean that all Scientologists believe the same thing. But institutionally, the Church of Scientology is insistent that all auditors, the people who conduct auditing sessions, are rigorously trained in the same way and according to the same standards. And the Church emphasizes what's known as standard tech. So all staff are trained in standard tech, and standard tech is the spiritual technology precisely as L. Ron Hubbard intended it to be understood and practiced. You can probably see where this is going. The Free Zone disagrees. Generally speaking, the Free Zone says that actually standard tech could mean a number of things. As I've already said, it's an umbrella term for a range of Scientologies, and they're very diverse in nature. So in my own work, I've described the Free Zone as a fluid social environment. It's not marked by institutional hierarchies the way that the Church of Scientology is. Rather, it's a range of groups of people who sometimes collaborate, sometimes disagree with one another. So these fluidity and boundaries can emerge between them depending on their interpretation of the tech. So we can see in this slide the way that these groups emerged. L. Ron Hubbard published Dianetics and then published the Church of Scientology. He founded the Church of Scientology. And then these various groups began to emerge. You have independent Scientologists, who are just everyday people doing Scientology in their own home. There are groups as well, such as Ronzog in Switzerland and the Draw Center in Israel, who consist of people who have left the Church of Scientology and set up their own groups. What I find very interesting about the research that I've done is that, and this wasn't intentional, but every single Free Zoner I've met and interviewed was a former Church of Scientology member and had left. I had not met a single one who had become involved in the Free Zone without passing through the Church of Scientology. That fascinates me no end. It wasn't intentional. I didn't go looking for Church of Scientology members. That's just how it went. So the Church and the Free Zone can best be contrasted by top-down hierarchy and horizontal fluidity. The Religious Technology Center is an institution that says this is the tech of Scientology, and church members will receive this precise tech. It goes down. But in the Free Zone, it is horizontal. You have Free Zone groups such as Ronzog. You can have spiritual counselors who, some of them don't even identify as Scientologists. I've met, or rather interviewed, spiritual counselors who were former church members who now use the tech in what they call spiritual therapy. They don't say it's Scientology. They don't tell their practitioners that it's Scientology, but they are using practices developed by L. Ron Hubbard. And you have then the independent Scientologists. And these all interact with one another. Sometimes they disagree with one another, but they are not bound by institutional structures. So as you can probably tell from my approach here, I'm very much drawing from the lived and vernacular religion approach. The study of new religious movements has for years been dominated by questions such as brainwashing and the cult debate. I wanted to move my research beyond that because I think we were going around in circles at that point. Rather, I think it's better from my perspective to take the Leonard Primiano approach. And I quote this in every single piece of work I write. I look at religion as it is lived, as human beings encounter, understand, interpret, and practice it. So I went out looking for Free Zone Scientologists who would be willing to speak to me, and I would essentially just analyze what they say. So what did I find when I went out seeking these people? Well, firstly, I found that schisms have emerged in Scientology since the 1950s. Carol Cusack and her work has drawn our attention to Dianology, for example. But as I mentioned, the term Free Zone is now most commonly associated with Captain Bill, as he's known affectionately, who led the first major Scientologist schism in the 1980s. During this period, an estimated 10,000 people left the church. These figures are contested, however. I can't find a truly reliable source that says that this is the case. But I think the fact that this figure is thrown around is quite suggestive in and of itself. regarding how much of almost a crisis it was for the Church of Scientology at the time. This was an incredibly prestigious and high-ranking member of the Church of Scientology, essentially defecting. And there were conspiracy theories at the time as well that L. Ron Hubbard had died and that the Church of Scientology were covering it up. And this ties in with some of the theories as well that the government were controlling the church. Well, Captain Bell went on to found Ronzog. Ronzog is the largest organised free zone community that exists at the moment. And Ronzog, you could probably see this coming, they say they practice standard tech. But what they say standard tech is completely different to what the Church of Scientology say standard tech is. So I've interviewed Ronzog members who tell me that they generally use copies of Dianetics from 1969, although some of them may vary with some of those 1960s publications, because in the 1970s, when these questions emerge about where on earth L. Ron Hubbard was he alive, was he dead? Some say that he was cloned. There are questions concerning the validity of republications of Scientologist texts. According to James Lewis's work, Ronzog is now estimating to be producing more trained auditors per year than the contemporary Church of Scientology. And so this is quite an interesting thing, isn't it? Does this mean that free zone numbers are rising while Church of Scientology numbers look like they're either in decline or stagnating? It's very difficult to determine how many free zoners there are. I get asked it all the time. And one of the reasons it's so difficult is that so many free zone Scientologists simply don't advertise that they do it. They may do it individually. And some have told me that they tend to not advertise their auditing services because they fear legal retribution from the Church of Scientology because of copyright and so forth. So the free zone is a broad category, but you can generally divide Church of Scientology schisms into two categories. Firstly, the free zone group of the 1980s associated with Captain Bill. And then interestingly, in the early 21st century, a large group of Scientologists left the church under the leadership of David Miscavige. And they're known as the Independents or as the Indies. And they level their criticisms of Scientology at the management of the church, whether that's fees for auditing services or allegations of malpractice and so forth. So some of them draw a line between themselves and the free zoners that they say, well, I'm not free zone, I'm independent. I don't have anything to do with Captain Bill. I wasn't interested in the conspiracy theories about whether L. Ron Hubbard was dead or not. As far as I'm concerned, L. Ron Hubbard died in 1986, as per the official record. So here you can see boundaries already emerging between these groups that are universally known as the free zone, for want of a better category. So many free zoners practice independently, away from institutional bodies or regulations. I've met free zoners who practice in hotels, for example. They'll meet each other in hotel rooms and they'll have they'll hold auditing sessions like that, or they'll just do it in their own home. As I say to my students as well, that's essentially no different to early Christianity being practiced in living rooms as well. Now, this is where things get spicy. The Church of Scientology is, perhaps unsurprisingly, not very fond of the free zone, because what they essentially see the free zone doing is an unorthodox and frankly invalid form of Scientology. And part of this draws from L. Ron Hubbard's own institutional framework of the Church of Scientology. In 1965, he published a bulletin called Keeping Scientology Working, KSW, and Scientologists were referred to this document a lot, simply by the acronym KSW. And you could almost, perhaps a little crudely, describe it as commandments of Scientology. Donald Westbrook has described it as the crown jewel of Scientology's systematic theology. And part of keeping Scientology working is stopping people from doing it outside the church. And L. Ron Hubbard referred to this practice as squirreling. Anybody who does Scientology outside the church is a squirrel, because they would have to be nutty to leave. And the act of squirreling has, according to Shorey, become an egregious crime against the church, resulting in excommunication and shunning of members accused of perpetrating these activities. It is a very controversial practice from the Church of Scientology's perspective, and squirreling isn't simply a different type of Scientology, it is just not Scientology. The picture I've put in the slide is of the t-shirts worn by the Squirrel Busters. If you're familiar with some recent Scientology history, you'll know that Marty Rathbun, who was a former high-ranking member of the Church of Scientology, left and became an independent Scientologist. He was running a blog talking about doing Scientology outside the church, criticizing the church and so forth. And a group of people appeared at his front door wearing these t-shirts, saying they were from Squirrel Busters Productions. They had cameras attached to their heads, and they were asking him, why is he squirreling? What he's doing isn't Scientology. He's delivering a harmful practice because Scientology concerns the mind, and the church has concerns about people essentially changing it on a whim. It was quite a controversial event. A lot of media outlets picked up on it, and the police did get involved as well. But what that incident does draw our attention to is the idea of control. Control is at the heart of these boundaries and the fluidity as well. Who controls Hubbard's work and what is Hubbard's work? So the issue of standard tech, how Hubbard intended people to practice it, is widely contested. From the fact that Hubbard continued writing throughout his leadership of the Church of Scientology shows that Scientology was developing, that new aspects were emerging or aspects were being refined, and different groups of Scientologies now lay claim to a true standard tech or correct standard tech. So Helisoi has previously said that Ronzog marks its legitimacy by portraying itself as adhering to true Scientology in contrast to the church, which is teaching a false and altered version. And I suppose as a scholar of new religions, I couldn't talk about the Church of Scientology without bringing in Weber. But when David Miscavige became leader of the Church of Scientology, the chairman of the board is his job title, he essentially had the challenging role of what on earth do you do after the death of the charismatic leader, the charismatic founder of the new religion? And for scholars of new religions, Eileen Barker has written a lot about this. What happens to new religions after the founder dies? Well, what David Miscavige did was he set up the Religious Technology Center, and he draws his authority from the idea of standard tech, that standard tech has now become routinized in the Church of Scientology. Weber said that rules in some form always come to govern, and that a charismatic leader is likely to be replaced by administrative structures. The administrative structures here are the Church of Scientology. And thus you have the charisma of office. So David Miscavige isn't a charismatic leader, but according to the Weberian idea of routinized charisma, the Church of Scientology has that charisma. So there are a number of ways that the Church of Scientology maintains that status. So as the charismatic office of Scientology, the church has now become an institutional embodiment of the founder. And this is particularly based on the principle of keeping Scientologists working and ensuring that standard tech is practiced around the world. But what's very interesting about this is that in recent years, David Miscavige has revealed he's overseen a series of projects known as the Golden Age of Tech and the Golden Age of Knowledge. And the Golden Age of Knowledge involved republishing all of L. Ron Hubbard's work as they were intended to be read in the first place. Already you're probably thinking, oh, free zoners are going to have a problem with that. Church members told me that L. Ron Hubbard, because he wrote so much and so on, he would often speak into a dictaphone, and perhaps somebody editing his notes would make mistakes. Certain chapters in his books would be in the wrong places and so on. So the idea of golden age of knowledge is that everyone now has access to pure L. Ron Hubbard and remastered recordings of his lectures. But the particularly controversial aspect for the free zone is that the golden age of tech, which was the initiative launched soon after, involved refining the auditing process, which inherently does involve a change. Now, for the church, this is simply making the practice of auditing, practice of the tech, in line with what Hubbard intended all along. But the free zoners contest that, of course. On the screen, you can see the flag headquarters. This is the Church of Scientology's worldwide headquarters in Clearwater, Florida. I took this photo on my honeymoon because I dragged my wife to see it because we were nearby. I have a very patient wife, of course. And when I came back from honeymoon and told my supervisors about it, I think they thought I was quite mad. But I couldn't be that close, of course, and not go and see it. And in this building, the reason I'm showing it to you is that there are a series of practices, new practices called the Superpower Rundown and the Cause Resurgence Rundown, which are understood to be advanced forms of auditing. And this building is the only place in the world that Church of Scientology members can access it. So now we have the question of, well, what do the free zoners think about this? Well, from our perspective as outsiders, what we're seeing here, and from a scholarly perspective, are debates of orthodoxy and heterodoxy. So the Church of Scientology has now created a barrier between itself and the free zone. This is authentic tech. This is authentic Scientology. And Miscavige has cemented his role as the leader of the Church of Scientology by drawing from Hubbard's authority. Well, Hubbard set up the Church of Scientology. This is Hubbard's organization. And Hubbard wrote the KSW bulletin that says that we shouldn't do this outside of the Church of Scientology. But there is now, in recent years, a reversal of the squirreling dynamic. The Church of Scientology say that the free zoners squirrel, but free zoners that I've interviewed say, actually, the Church of Scientology squirrel. Because of these golden age projects of republishing L. Ron Hubbard's work, changing certain aspects or introducing new processes like the Superpower Rundown, the free zone say that actually the church are now squirreling. They are changing the tech. This is not standard tech. I interviewed a free zoner called Eric, and this is what he told me when I mentioned the golden age of tech to him. He said, I know of the golden age of tech. It is more bullshit from Miscavige. These changes are not in the LRH. That's how they'll often refer to L. Ron Hubbard in an endearing way. These changes are not in the LRH vision of auditing. They have two purposes, money and to make auditing heavier and longer. The independent field will never consider using it in its practice. The independents are loyal to LRH tech because it works wonderfully and gives results. So what you see here is an accusation of squirreling, that the Church of Scientology is changing the practice. But it seems at complete odds to the idea of keeping Scientology working, which is all about keeping it within the church. So debate rages in the free zone regarding Hubbard's authority on the tech. So some will dispute what the correct interpretations are, but others will say, actually, L. Ron Hubbard wouldn't particularly care if we changed certain aspects. Perhaps we could develop it and we could change the tech to our own personal preferences. And this is when I then started to meet free zoners who said, well, some of Scientology is useful, and I'll use some of Scientology in my spiritual therapy, but I've also changed aspects as well. I'll do things slightly differently because I think it works better for me. And that's on the grounds of, well, L. Ron Hubbard simply wouldn't mind. So this creates a barrier in the free zone itself. And a free zoner I interviewed called Chris referred to this as with LRH Scientologists and not with LRH Scientologists. Now, from a scholarly perspective, that boundary isn't as clear as Chris has made it out to be, but I find his statement really interesting nonetheless. He said, consider the field of free zone Scientology as having two factions, more or less. There are people who are with LRH and the people who are not. The with LRH people are often the most trained and educated in the subject. They insist on precision of application in the technology and adherence to the policies laid down by Ron in relation to the technology. The other people do not run standard Scientology. They mix it up with other things or think they have some better idea than Ron about this or that. On the other side of the coin, when I spoke to a free zoner called Jeff, by the way, these are all pseudonyms, but when I spoke to Jeff, he told me that, well, there is no standard tech. Somebody may have told you this, but standard tech was what Ron Hubbard said at that moment. He said there is only one standard tech. He said this in 50 to 52. In the 70s, there were three or four different versions of standard tech. In other words, standard tech was whatever Ron realized he was writing at the time. You can see the iterations of standard tech, so that if you were practicing, if you were a practicing auditor as I was, you found that you were really working with this whole bunch of technology that had bandages on. So what he's essentially saying is that L. Ron Hubbard claimed that different aspects of Scientology were standard tech at different times. And he quite candidly told me that, well, how do free zoners lay claim to a single standard tech when it is very contested and difficult? So here we can see again, it's an error to say that Free Zone Scientology is a united group. And sometimes you see that happening. You've got the church on one hand and the Free Zone on the other. They're united in their opposition of the Church of Scientology. That's not necessarily so. Sometimes they just don't get on with each other simply because they can't agree on standard tech and what other Scientologists are doing. Before I wrap up, I want to talk about in this aspect of innovation that I've just referred to, the idea of changing Scientology. I spoke to a few free zoners who said that Hubbard always encouraged people to develop Scientology, that Hubbard didn't create Scientology after all, he simply discovered it, and we are discovering other aspects. What you can see in this slide that I've shared is that other people have started changing the material culture of Scientology. So while I drew your attention to the e-meter earlier with its metallic cans and its lie detector aesthetic, some free zoners have developed a e-meter app that they simply run on their computer and it responds to what the individual is saying. And others will now do it digitally. This was pre-pandemic as well. I'd be very interested to go back and speak to some of these free zoners post-pandemic to see how they handled this. But I spoke to one free zoner who would have an e-meter with him in his office running an auditing session, and his patient, known as the pre-clear, would sit on the other side and would not be holding the canisters. But because the auditor was, there would still be responses with the needle. From the Church of Scientology's perspective, this is what L. Ron Hubbard previously described as Black Scientology. In other words, inauthentic Scientology, changing the tech in a way that isn't according to Hubbard's original work. Of course, it is also worth mentioning that Hubbard most likely couldn't have possibly have predicted the rise of the internet. So what Hubbard would make of it now, of course, we don't know. And this is how the free zoners are able to say that L. Ron Hubbard would be fine with these changes because he would see the internet develop himself as well. And a free zoner I spoke to a few years ago said that he has pre-clears. These are people who are beginning their journey as Scientologists on the bridge to total freedom. He said, I have pre-clears in Australia, America, Germany, and in Sweden. I just sit here and do it. I don't use the e-meter. All of Scientology in the 50s was researched and discovered without the e-meter. An e-meter is, in my opinion, something that L. Ron Hubbard invented in order to be able to train people who couldn't think with the tech. Those who needed a tool in order to get involved with the pre-clear's reactive mind. Without the e-meter, you can have a greater presence and a greater range of questions. For many years, I vowed to never audit without the e-meter or on Skype. But then I had two pre-clears here last summer who paid for hotels and thought, we don't want to do this. Why don't you audit us on Skype? Remember Skype? Skype seems to have disappeared in the pandemic. Voice to video chat arms race, hasn't it? So I asked if they dared try, we would give it a go. And I've done it ever since. It worked perfectly. It was totally natural. People restrict themselves because they think they can't audit without an e-meter. Bullshit. Auditing works very well without an e-meter. Now, from the Church of Scientology's perspective, an e-meter is an essential device. To use the e-meter is to do auditing, is to do Scientology. So for someone to say that they are practicing Scientology online, that they are doing it not in the same room, not in the physical presence of the pre-clear, to not use the e-meter and so on, this would not be considered as standard tech according to the Church of Scientology. But this particular free zoner, when I spoke to him about standard tech, didn't seem to be particularly bothered about it. He had a very fluid approach to it. If it works, it works. All he said that he wanted was to give results to the people that were coming to him for auditing sessions. So before I wrap up, because I love material culture, there's a free zone marketplace now for e-meters, people making their own. So the Church of Scientology e-meter that I showed you earlier was very lavish in its design, very slick. It's the most recent model that they've been using. But there are plenty of homemade e-meters beyond the ones that you can use as an app. And some of them have a very retro aesthetic. Here you can see the Ability Meter Model 3A, a very retro design. And a lot of these e-meters have different functions, different features, and people will use them according to their own preference. So they could customize it, or they pick the one that works best for them. Again, here you can see the lack of hierarchical structures in the free zone, that lack of guidance, that lack of institutional supervision, that individuals are simply able to practice Scientology in the way that they want. So to conclude, what I found throughout my research that auditing is Scientology. To do auditing is to do Scientology according to many Scientologists across both the Church and the Free Zone. But for the Free Zone in particular, while the Church of Scientology has other aspects to it now, there are various L. Ron Hubbard courses about how to manage your workload, for example, or how to raise children. And there's a very institutionally religious angle to the Church of Scientology. They have chapels, for example. For the Free Zone, it's all about auditing. For Free Zone Scientologists, auditing is Scientology. But because the Free Zone has different understandings of Scientology and different understandings of the tech, it has become a fluid and dynamic category. So the innovative practices that we've seen here today point to a breakdown, in my view, of the Weberian model of routinized charisma. There's very little routine to the Free Zone, very little bureaucracy or institutional bodies, in contrast to the Church of Scientology. And part of this is because of the emergence of the internet, where like-minded Scientologists have been able to connect with one another based on their understanding of Scientology or based on their rejection of the Church. And in my opinion, this contrast between the Church on the one hand and the Free Zone on the other points to wider issues for us as scholars of religion in the 21st century. Because beyond the death of a charismatic leader, we need to ask, how do religions develop? How do they develop in the digital age? What impact does the internet have to empower people to connect with one another and to change their own spiritual practice, that lived religion aspect? So how do horizontal structures, how do fluid horizontal movements practice religion in the 21st century? And how do other people attempt to sidestep or subvert the control of other institutions? So I'll stop there because I could talk about this all day. And thank you very much. If anybody's got any questions or comments or anything for discussion, I absolutely welcome it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Thomas. So I'll open the floor to questions or comments. You can type in the chat or you can put up your hand.
Hi, Aled. Can I ask a question? Sorry, David.
Yes, absolutely.
Really liked your presentation. I guess as a guy in his 40s, I did flirt with Scientology in my 20s. I did read Dianetics, and as you say, it's a very compelling book. And I guess since that book was written, clearly there's been a lot of controversy and a lot of movies made about the practice of Scientology. But do you regard the what you call the free zone? Is this really just a collection of counselors, consultants who are using the tools of Scientology, but you said they always come from the church. But do you find people who are in therapy, as counselors, psychologists, do any of them actually use the e-meter as a tool without having the history of Scientology?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I did. It's not that I tried to avoid it. Everyone I met were former Church of Scientology members. I have seen there are Facebook groups recently that have become quite popular with Free Zone Scientologists, where some people are discovering Scientology through that route and not through the Church of Scientology. And some of them are working on connecting e-meters to their computers so that they can record the results on computers. So I don't think it's a difficult one to describe, because I try to step away from the idea of the Free Zone as a united group, and it isn't a particularly great term, because so many people who we would say are in the Free Zone, if we're to use it as an umbrella category, they don't find it an adequate term. The Indies, for example, would reject me calling them the Free Zone.
And do they self-identify as a religion? Do they see themselves as a religion, or are they just quite a different,
It depends who you speak to. Generally speaking, and I do mean generally speaking here, those who lay claim to a standard tech are more likely to refer to Scientology as a religion. Ronzog, for example, institutionally they refer to Scientology as a religion, but it's very much on a case-to-case basis for individuals. Some simply say Scientology works, it gives me results. The religion aspect was L. Ron Hubbard's thing. That's not particularly applicable to me. There's a phrase used in Scientology a lot. What's true is what's true for you. Even though I hear that being said by Church of Scientology members, it's certainly an approach that seems to be adopted, I beg your pardon, by Free Zoners. I have met another person in the Free Zone who says he's an independent Scientologist who, when discussing with everyday people his religious beliefs, would refer to himself as a Buddhist, because he says that Scientology for him is essentially a technological Buddhism. He believes in karma, he believes in reincarnation. He simply uses these technological tools. Scientology, of course, emerged in the 1950s during that that sci-fi boom as well that L. Ron Hubbard was informed in. You can see that in his work. But he says that he avoids saying that he's a Scientologist simply because he may get raised eyebrows or people not knowing what he means and so on. So he just finds it easier to say that he's Buddhist. I found that very interesting.
And just one final comment. I guess Scientology's history is very, very short in comparison to other religions. So I guess we all have to be careful in terms of how we're judging it. As you say, if it's useful, it's useful. But whether it will survive, I guess, is the bigger question. Will the organization actually kill the technology? Will it emerge from, where it came from and emerge into something else? Or, it's an interesting thought, I guess. But thank you very much. It was a very interesting presentation.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Arjen?
Yeah, thank you, Alette. That was a very lovely presentation. Thank you very much. So, yeah, you talked a bit about the material culture of Scientology and the Free Zone Scientology as well. And one of the strategies of legitimizing or trying to control the tech by the Church of Scientology has been to use copyright, right? Which you delineated in your presentation. But how does that actually work when people are starting making their own e-meters? Isn't it possible to have a patent on the e-meters or have some kind of copyright claim on that? Does the Church of Scientology try to combat that as well? And are they just not succeeding in that? So how does that work, the e-meter and trying to control that?
Yeah. That is a very interesting question, because normally the conversations of copyright tend to go around the texts of Scientology. So there's a recent publication called the Handbook of Scientology, and there's a chapter in that by Shorey, who talks about the LRH for All project, which was when a group of disaffiliated church members leaked L. Ron Hubbard's texts online for free. That they said that L. Ron Hubbard's principle was that the work is free, the tech is free, people should have access to it. And it's that practice of Scientology that I've seen pushback from the Church of Scientology, not so much about the e-meters, interestingly. So when I spoke to church members about the free zone, you know, sometimes they would make references to the e-meters and say, oh, well, they're not using proper e-meters and stuff like that. The e-meter is no doubt patented or patented, whichever one you want to go with. It's that, you know, there's definitely an attempt to control that, but I haven't seen any pushback from the church towards people making their own e-meters as of yet.
Aled, you were talking about, you know, people's opinions on whether L. Ron Hubbard would agree with their application of the tech. I'm wondering about at the time when he was alive, for example, the process church at the final judgment, or people using concepts or the material culture of Scientology in their own way. Was there any reaction to that? Do you know?
Oh, from L. Ron Hubbard himself?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, in the sense that that's why he set up the Keep Scientology Working process, bulletin rather. It was a direct response to the fact that people were already practicing the tech outside the church even then. And there are cynics who say that this was an attempt to maintain financial control of Scientology practices, that if somebody wants auditing, they have to pay for it at a Church of Scientology. But from the church's perspective and from the perspective of keeping Scientology working, it's about ensuring that people get a tech that has been tested by L. Ron Hubbard and is therefore deemed safe. So church members I've spoken to about the free zone have expressed concern about the fact that because they're dealing with the human mind here and they're dealing with psychological issues, that somebody just changing the tech or changing Scientology could be harmful to free zone Scientologists because it hasn't been tested and so forth. It is worth mentioning here, of course, that Scientology auditing isn't endorsed by the psychiatric community, and there is a tension between Scientology and psychology. After all, in terms of when Captain Bill Robertson left the free zone, there wasn't an official statement. Left the church to found the free zone. There wasn't a statement from L. Ron Hubbard, but the church would say that this isn't because he was, you know, dead and there'd been a cover-up. He had already taken a step back from public life in the early 1980s. In the very early 80s, he established the Church of Scientology International, which, this is the hard thing about studying the Church of Scientology. There are so many different organizations associated with it, whether it's the Religious Technology Center or Church of Scientology International. And the idea of the Church of Scientology International was to manage church affairs. So they were running the Church of Scientology while he was able to take a step back, and he spent the remaining years of his life auditing himself and developing Scientology further. L. Ron Hubbard was constructing what was known as the Bridge to Total Freedom, and he was continuously working up that bridge and working on the upper levels of Scientology. So there was no public acknowledgement of it. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thanks. So we'll take Elizabeth's question as the final question.
I always have to have a question. This is really fascinating. You mentioned the lie detector device, and I was just wondering what, from studying the history of it, what is Marston's lie detector influence? Because obviously that was prior to the machine. And yeah, also the relationship to spiritualism, because that, as I understand too, like using a device to validate authority spiritually through the physical with the metaphysical is like a trend that started in the 1800s. And I'm wondering how you see that. And then it's interesting that there is a guru, whereas in early times that was a way to give disenfranchised voices. So what's your what's your take on that?
It's an interesting one, because the e-meter wasn't necessarily invented by L. Ron Hubbard. It was largely the creation of a man called Volney Matheson. And Matheson and Hubbard had been playing with, I guess playing sounds like I don't mean playing in a derogatory sense. They had been experimenting and trying things out with lie detectors. They were using lie detectors, and the e-meter came from that. Matheson and Hubbard then had a falling out in the early years of Dianetics, and Hubbard rebranded the meter. It had a number of names. There was something like the Hubbard electrometer and things like that. He was putting his own stamp on it, and Matheson kind of got pushed out of the picture somewhat. The difficulty of studying L. Ron Hubbard's life is the hagiography surrounding him. And the Church of Scientology do present a hagiography of L. Ron Hubbard as being an exemplary person of exceptional intelligence and talent and so on. And part of that was discovering Scientology. So it does have that root in lie detection. But the emphasis on picking up the spirit was what interested me, because when I first visited the Church of Scientology, I'd already done a master's dissertation on Scientology, and they asked if they could have a copy of it before I visited. So yeah, that's absolutely fine. I sent them a copy, and they gave me some very interesting feedback on it, because in it I said that the e-meter picks up the electronic galvanic skin response of the hands. And they told me, well, that's simply incorrect, because it's picking up the spirit. It's measuring the spirit. It's measuring the thetan. So Hubbard said that the human body is essentially an animated vegetable. If you think of the body as a car, the thetan is driving the car. The thetan is attempting to interact with what's known as MEST, matter, energy, space, and time. I'm really going down the routes now with all the specialized Scientology jargon. But one of the core ideas of Scientology is that the thetan is trapped. It is trapped in this physical universe. It needs to be liberated from it, and it does that through auditing. So for the thetan, being attached to one's body is harmful because of pains that we experience and so on, our interaction with the world. We need to move beyond that. So the e-meter isn't addressing the body per se, it's addressing the thetan. Again, I hope I'm answering your question.
Which is very similar to spiritualism, and
yeah, absolutely.
I mean, that whole move, that's really interesting.
And when Scientology emerged, it did do it alongside this. There was a not simply New Age movements with an emphasis on self-improvement, but there was a popularity at the time for self-help books. Self-help books were selling extremely well, and Dianetics was kind of at the forefront of that. That when Dianetics did become a bestseller, it wasn't an anomaly or something that was quite out there. Self-help books were selling very well. During that post-World War II period, there was an appetite for that, and then of course with developing the religion angle as well, there is definitely that spiritualism aspect. I think there's definitely parallels between New Age movements and Scientology for sure.
Thank you so much, Aled. We actually would keep you talking all day, so I will end the recording.
Oh, I wouldn't want to bore you all to tears.